Dr. Sarai Rivera is serving her fifth two-year term as District 4 Councilor. District 4 generally includes the following neighborhoods: Green Island, Kelley Square, Lower Vernon Hill, the Canal District, Four Corners, Main South, South Worcester, Piedmont, Crown Hill, downtown west of Main Street, Gardner, Kilby, Hammond, Clark University, Webster Square, and Highland Street east of Park Ave. Councilor Rivera has worked professionally within the Worcester community in the field of human services and mental health since 1988 and has extensive experience in community mental health and interventions for multicultural populations in urban settings.
Today we are joined with Dr. Sarai Rivera. She's serving her fifth term here in Worcester as the district counselor for District 4. That's actually the district where Major Bloom, my marijuana establishment, is located. So very special to have her today. She's worked in the community of Worcester since 1988 on the mental health side, as well as working with multicultural populations. So super excited to have her here. So Sarai, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I was hoping you can spend a little bit of time about your background, how you got into politics, and also how you're an ordained pastor, and what really got you interested in being a district counselor.
All right. So really quick, I came to live here since the age of 4. I'm originally from the Bronx, New York, but Worcester's been my home. It's the only home I've ever really known. And so as much as I love New York, I could only take it in spaces. Like I can't even imagine ever living there because it's the only home I've ever known. Right. I fell in love with the city. I think like anyone grappling through life, especially as a person of color, growing up at a time that I did in Worcester, there's always kind of this love-hate relationship. I think during your adolescence and young adulthood, when you're finally like understanding so many things about what it means to be a person of color in a predominantly very white space environment. I think eventually I learned to just fall in love with this city for many reasons, and decided to, even though I went to school, stay here and raise my family, raise my children. And thank God I have raised all of my children. My youngest is 21. And so I'm officially an empty nester. Well, pre-COVID. Now COVID, I'm kind of a full nester again. But, it's been so I'm third generation ordained minister. My grandfather, my father, first woman, and my mother was also a theologian and very highly respected, and actually trained many pastors in the community. Now again, being a PK, and you understand this, is probably I wasn't necessarily rebellious. I wasn't that kind because my mama scared me, and I wasn't trying to be rebellious because, I come from the generation of you get whooped. And then, they'll embarrass you like straight up right in front of your friends. Like if you out too long, they be yelling out the window, like, should I move your bed out there? So it just wasn't cool. So I, but definitely I didn't think that this was the life I wanted. I didn't really want to be, to have anything regarding being ordained or serving in ministry per se. My husband is also third generation minister, ironically enough. And both his grandparents and my parents were what we call church planters together. So our families have a lot of history together, which is really interesting that we ended up the same, even though we were raised, like he was raised in Puerto Rico and I was raised here, which is really weird that we ended up finding each other. So call it whatever, destiny, fate, divine intervention. And 32 years later, we're still together. So we both got ordained together at the same time, and just finally, kind of like Moses, I kind of came kicking and screaming a little bit, but eventually answered the call that I felt. I knew, though, that serving in ministry, that church was more than the four walls. That church wasn't about what we came to celebrate on a weekend, but the church was more than that, right? That we were the church, and that what were we here mandated to do? And especially doing urban ministry, like in your urban setting. What did this mean for us in an urban setting? And so what was really important was that I felt the calling from God to really to understand that in order for me to really fully properly minister, I needed to honor the greatest commandment, which was love God and love neighbor, right? And that I couldn't just say, oh, I love God, and ignore everything that was going on with my neighbor, regardless of who my neighbor was. Like, I wasn't there to ask, is my neighbor poor? Is my neighbor rich? Is my neighbor white? Is my neighbor black? Is my neighbor straight? Is my neighbor gay? It doesn't matter. Is my neighbor Christian? Is my neighbor atheist? It didn't matter. God says, love your neighbor, right? And so what did I need to do? What was happening outside those walls? And so I think, as I'm also a clinical therapist, so my work in kind of combining all of that really saw so many issues, and then systems issues. And that eventually led me to be kind of advocating in the community, which eventually people kept saying, you should run for office. And I was always the one saying, I'm the preacher, not the politician, so I can say whatever I want to say. And to me, like, being a politician was like a dirty word, right? Like, you don't even want to. I remember the first time I was called that, I cried. I literally hung up the phone. I was doing like calls, and I'm like, oh, somebody called. I swear, you would have thought somebody cursed my mama, right? Yeah. And I called up my mentor where I did my doctorate, who was just amazing. And I called him up and I was telling him how I felt. And he gave me this whole breakdown of the word politics. And he made, it was about the people, and it made me feel so much better, about what I was doing. Again, I think to me, going into public office, to me, has been a calling and not something of just wanting to do. Because honestly, I think if it were up to me, kind of like Moses, I probably would have stayed chilling with the Midianites. He had a good life. He was chill. He didn't have to go deal with Pharisee or anybody else, right? He was just, God called him. He had been 40 years just chilling with the Midianites, living, his father-in-law owned all this sheep and all this land. He married into good. He was chilling. He was fine. And all of a sudden his life just got disrupted. And that's a little bit kind of how I felt. My sister often calls me Moses. She teases me all the time. She used to tease me all the time. So, I think I came at a time that the people were really just exhausted, emotionally tired, and sick and tired of feeling like they didn't have that they had a voice, but their voices weren't heard, right. And that they were not part of a decision-making table, right? Because one thing is for you to be yelling and screaming and voicing out and crying out, but one is you just ignore it. And so my campaign was based on that, was about the voice of the people and being part of the decision-making table and collectively governing. And I think people knew I was connected to community, and we took a long shot. I was definitely the underdog. And when we won, and we won as big as we did, it really sent the message. And here I am. But it's really about me working collectively with community. And so that's kind of that.
Do you still feel like is it an election year? Do you still feel like you're an underdog at this point?
No, I think I've paid my dues. I think I've had people challenge me. I've had people really play very dirty politics, very, very dirty politics. They have done things that I never imagined I would have to tolerate, that I would have to do. And they were days that I definitely survived nearly only because I was on my knees and just praying to God for strength and to continue not to be defocused. Right. That because when you have a calling, I always say God puts and God will take me out when it's done. When my mission is over, then I will terminate. And I think oftentimes it's kind of like Jesus when he was tempted in the desert. It really has brought me closer to God, actually, because it really has shown me so much in perspective. Like when he's in the desert, he's about to just launch in his ministry, and here comes Satan with all these temptations. He could have just given up. He could have been like, listen, man, forget this. Like, I got my throne. I could be chilling up in my glory. I don't need this. And yet, what ended up doing was, he just fought that temptation and he did what he needed to do. Right. And so I think that oftentimes those darts, as the psalmist says, came, but almost just to throw me out. Will you quit when you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death? Will you quit, or will you walk through and know you're going to make it over to the other side? And so I think I had to learn to kind of just tolerate some of that stuff. And so I think I still get targeted many times, but it is what it is. And I have to just count it all joy, as the apostle said.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's an interesting perspective from you because you do have this very spiritual, religious background, but then also being an influential part of the community as a counselor. So just kind of getting into some cannabis questions here in your role.
Yep.
You've been here, the counselor for 10 years. Marijuana was legalized for adult use in 2016 and then medical in 2012. So you've kind of been through that transition where it was decriminalized in 2008. How has your role changed, from 2010 to 2020 today involving cannabis, kind of like the before and after?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. That's a really good question because I'm going to really be very honest about this. I was pretty much anti anything because, I'm not someone who drinks. And I think I lost a friend when I was very young, when I was 16. And I think I've seen kind of like all the liquor stores in my district, in my communities and in populations where people of color, like predominantly you see these liquor stores, not just in Worcester, but in many places, and kind of just the drug. And to me, I kind of, as you remember, I grew up in an era where it was all considered kind of this drug. No one was talking about cannabis the way we're talking about it now. Right. And so being clumped into that, for me, I was very anti marijuana, definitely. Right. Having this happen has helped me engage in other conversations. And although I'm not pro marijuana, I'm an equal, as like I told you when we met, I'm kind of an equal opportunity offender. I think if you can accept people accept liquor stores, they have to be able to accept cannabis. I mean, I think it's hypocritical of people in society to accept one and not accept another. Right. When you really look at the history of this. And so I also have, especially now that, the opiate crisis has been around, as you know, in communities of color for a long time. Right. The issue of cocaine and crack. We grew up with, the whole thing of the 80s were really devastating to our community, and how no one really was paying attention to this epidemic of cocaine and crack, and really crack, because it was a less expensive, and cocaine was like glorified, right? Yeah. And again, that was a race behind that. And then we were seeing disparity on opiate overdoses way like over 15 years ago. Like, this is not just in the last, we've been struggling with this for a long time. It only became an opiate crisis when it was affecting kind of affluent people and more predominantly community. Then all of a sudden it became a crisis. Also, the fact that we were looking at medications that people were utilizing, such as the opioids, different opioids, which is Percocets, Vicodins, Oxy. Also for mental health, taking a look at some of the benzos that people were using, whether it was Ativan or, Klonopin or, Valiums or whatever, and how, some of the pain management, so a number of different things, and how actually cannabis, people have been researching cannabis. And if we're open to be able to, very open about medication in general, obviously, and use especially psychotropic medication, the need for psychiatric medication, which we've come a long way, thank the Lord, in mental health, we still have a long way to go, that we really needed to kind of be able to be open to have this conversation. But it was interesting how you begin to see the systems and the monopolizing of systems, and how pharmaceutical companies and how they control one thing that is so harmful. If you look at, I think it was about 15 years ago, Kentucky, a town in Kentucky in the Appalachians sued the people that were distributing Oxycontin at the time, because it was like they were like literally just spoon feeding the Oxy, in these communities, and in this really very rural, poor white community, and the epidemic of Oxy here. And they actually won a class action suit, I think like 15 years ago. There's a report on that. So, I think it was really important. Definitely my views have changed significantly. Again, I'm not like pro, hey, everybody smoke weed, but I don't look at people the same. I think people like, oh, if you're smoking, well, I'm really anti-smoking because of the whole, and vaping because of the whole health issue. But in general, like the number of different things, I think if people say, like, no one, I actually teach about this in class when I was teaching as a professor, and I would say, hey, let's do the scenario that you're home, and I would tell the students, you're home visiting, right, on a leave, on a break, and your mother comes home and she's like this powerhouse, like CEO, And she comes home and you say, hey, Mom, how are you? You know, I'm making something you want to eat. And your mom says, oh, not right now. I kind of have to prepare for this like important meeting tomorrow and this brief. I'm going to go in the living room, pour myself a glass of wine and kind of unwind a little bit so I can prepare. Nobody bats an eye on that, right?
Right.
Now let's play the scenario again. And let's say, hey, you know, hi, Mom, how are you? How was your day? Oh, it's really hectic. And do you want something to eat? Not right now. I'm going to go into the living room. I'm going to just, you know, light up a blunt and kind of relax a little bit. Like all the students were like, what? You know, like the whole scenario, even the imagery of what the mother looks like everything changes in your mind, right? But honestly, like, what's the difference? Or if somebody even said, listen, I'm just going to just pour myself some bourbon. I'm going to just pour myself some, I don't even know, like whatever liquor is there, the shot of, no one bats an eye, but the minute you say anything else, right? It just shifts. But what's really the difference? There isn't. In fact, cannabis is a less lethal drug, right? Like I saw so many people overdosing on alcohol when I worked in an ER than I ever saw anything else. And when you go to college, like they do this whole talk about overdosing on alcohol, right? Like this is a thing. And nobody said, hey, overdosing on like, and I'm not promoting one or the other, but it's definitely, I'm just talking about how it shifted my thought and learning.
I mean, it's so too.
Yeah.
No one's ever died from cannabis use, you know?
Yeah. So definitely it's completely shifted. I went from being kind of working on the anti-cannabis campaign to kind of like understanding what this was about. Initially.
Was that the pastor, Sarai, or was that the political figure when you were talking anti?
I think a lot of it was personal. I think I still remember I come from the era I grew up in the late 70s, early 80s, and you know, this is your brain on drugs and all this crazy stuff. And when I was 16, you know, really close friend of mine died because of drugs. And I think there was always a sense of feeling like I couldn't save him. And although I wasn't involved in anything like that, and I was kind of the one, I don't drink. And I think people thought I'm just in rehabilitation. It's just that I chose not to drink in my life. It's just not something to me, I also saw alcohol as a drug. And to me, you know, I grew up in a very fundamentalist doctrine where, you know, all substances outside, you know, your body. And although obviously I know differently now, but to me, it's just not something I really did, not something I missed, and something I just chose not to do. And I honestly, I don't really care for it or miss it in any way. So again, that cannabis, I think it was all just really personal for me. So I think definitely there's a little bit of everything that combines you, but I think it was really defining by that 16-year-old young woman that just you know, saw this tragedy happen in her life.
Absolutely. No, that's great perspective. I want to go back to the medical. You said you worked in an ER. It seems like you worked.
Yeah, because I'm a clinical therapist, so I've been working mental health for a long time. So
there are disparities in the health system.
Oh Lord, yes. And COVID has just everybody's talking about all this stuff. I'm like, where y'all been? We've been talking about this forever. Yeah.
So we see the same with like medical marijuana facilities where these licenses are going specifically to, you know, the communities that are not impacted. You know, the communities that have been impacted are people that look like me, people of color, you know. You know, so, but they're not the ones that are, you know, basically winning these licenses. What can local politics, local government do to address the disparities kind of that exists inside the medical realm?
I think, you know, definitely that was really important to me. I think when applications were coming in and people were looking at this, I think it was really important for me to take a look at, number one, I think that if people who were opening up the dispensaries, I think if they were connected somehow to the community, that they weren't going to just have a free for all, right? So I really was, I also felt that people, especially communities of color, had a really clear understanding of what community were connected to community. And I felt like if they were involved, that they were definitely going to be contributors of community, which I think was really important to me as well. And so I felt like this was definitely is going to happen. Like the law is there, and so we whether you agree or disagree, the law is there. So for me, now that the law was present, was how do we make sure that this is equitable? So economic equity was a big issue, and social justice equity and health equity was a big issue. And those were all really, and it was really disturbing to me at the very beginning when I kept seeing like all of a sudden everybody who was like, because all that I talk about that, but I was talking to my daughter the other day, and I was saying, all those people that were like against marijuana, they were all smoking weed up in the 60s and 70s, right? Like all these grandparents now. I'm like, please. I remember I didn't smoke, but like all my friends, I thought I was crazy because, again, I was scared of my mama, and I swear to God, she had radar. I would have done anything. I was also anti because like I said, I had gone through that trauma. So for me, I would have never, to me, I had seen so many things that I was like, to me, that was like the devil's potions, right? Everything was the devil's potion. But, like all those people, like, and then they're coming out of the woodworks. They all like in the 60s and 70s had their field day. And now they were all coming out of the woodworks, and they were like, wait a minute, writing on the wall, we're making some money. So again, we incarcerated all our Black and brown people, right? All the people that look like us got incarcerated for doing the exact same thing that white folks are doing now.
Right.
And banking, like, listen, they're going to bank money. And again, there we go with economic injustice.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's I think that's the balance that is very difficult for people to wrap their heads around. When you think about medical, you think about patients, and you think about the safety of patients first. But with cannabis, you have to also consider the history and the disparities that exist already. So very often in many states across the nation, we see medical implemented without equity provisions. And us as a business here at Major Bloom, we didn't go that route and really focus on the adult use where there was economic programs, social programs to kind of help diversify a bit. And that's how we met, basically.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about the fact that some of the areas, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but the state has designated some of the areas that I believe are in your district and scattered out throughout Worcester that have been impacted the most.
It's probably the first time I don't have the most in my district of something. Usually I have the most in my district because I'm right in the middle and very dense.
Gotcha.
But
you know what I'm talking about then? You know the report I'm talking about?
Yes.
Right. Okay. All right, cool. So then being local here, you've been in Worcester for a while. What recommendations do you have for companies to help reverse some of those harms and those disparities in those communities?
I think definitely making sure that people are connected to community. If you're connected to community, you're not going to want to harm what you're connected to, right? Like your home is your home, and you take care of your home because it's your home, right? Your family, the people you care about, they're your circle, right? Your village, your circle. You don't want to bring harm to that village because that's your village.
Right.
So I think the more that people are integrated and I'm not talking about superficially. I'm not talking about, let's have a meeting and let's talk to community. I'm talking about really understanding, being embedded within that community, really understanding it, loving it, caring about it, not just because it's a bank account for you, but something that you understand. And if you're like embedded within a community, then that becomes you're part of that village, you're part of that community. You're not going to want harm for it. You're not going to want harm. You're going to care about like what happens. You're going to care if there's loitering. You're going to care if there's abuse. You're going to care if it's dirty. You're going to care if it's just going to matter to you. Right. You're going to care about the people. You're going to care about the infrastructure. You're going to care about the development, just like you would your own home. And that's what I was looking for. So for me, like I didn't want like big businesses that were connected in Delaware, Denver, Colorado, whatever, and that were coming here. And yes, they've been doing it for years because they were doing it in other states that it was legal and they kind of knew what it was doing, but they weren't part of this community. So I was very leery about kind of those folks that were coming in from other places that weren't going to appear. And I really appreciated people that were more embedded. Like my question every time I met with someone was like, what's your connection to Worcester? What's your connection to Worcester? And if they had a connection to Worcester, that mattered to me because I knew that if they had a connection to Worcester, if something went wrong, you were going to have to answer to a community that you were a part of.
Right.
You know, you couldn't just pick up and disappear. And I just didn't want like the equivalence of what we have in slumlords, right? Like the people who come and purchase properties and don't care about the properties and live somewhere else. And, you know, there's definitely a lot of great property owners that live outside, but there's a whole lot that they don't care.
Right.
And that's what I didn't want with this industry. And I was very fearful of that. And so I think that people that, one of the advantages of some of the folks that were from community that look like us, I think understood the concepts of marginalization. They understood the issues of inequity because we deal with this every day. It's unfortunately part of what we have to deal with every day.
Right.
So it makes us more sensitive to dealing with that in a community. Like things that you see, I could tell you things that you're just going to know automatically and you're going to understand because you live it versus me having to explain it to you.
Right.
You know, as a Black man, like there's things that I could tell you and you're going to understand, you know, like when I joked about my brother, you know, I don't got my hair did, you know, I would have to wrap it, and which I'm fine with, you know, you understood that. I probably would have had to explain to somebody else.
Right.
So I say that facetiously, but just in more serious terms, like, you know, if I say, did you have the talk? If you have a son, did you have the talk? Like, you're going to know what I'm talking about. It has nothing to do with sexuality, right? Like there's things that you and I understand, and so understands about community and neighborhood. And I think that that's really important. Also, again, the unfairness, like, again, there was like the opiate crisis. It wasn't a crisis when it was affecting our community. Right. But then the minute it affects affluent community became a crisis. The same thing with cannabis. We locked up so many people. Like, honestly, we should reverse all those like charges, all those sentences have to, you know, especially some of them that were just ridiculous. And now we have a white community that was, you know, people with more economic advantage. As you know, we also don't have inherited wealth, right, as you know, which is exactly, it's an issue. So there's all these factors that I think we definitely understand. And so I'm hoping that this is, you know, something that we can find some equity in, which is still a struggle. And I think as legislators, as people, we need to kind of, one of the things that I've been talking about is economic equity for the past few years, really firmly on. And I think whenever we're going to talk about anything economic development, businesses, erecting buildings, housing, whatever, we have to look at it from a racial lens. Right. And it's not like, oh, we need to find race, but this is the reality is that we've had redlining. We've had illegal banking procedures. We don't have the same inherited wealth. We have lower pay rate. Like there's so much in economic inequities. How we make, you know, them less money, not only as a person of color, as a woman. I mean, it just goes down the list. So we definitely need, when we look at something, we need to look at it from an equitable and from a lens with race, because that's the reality of the world we live in. You know, we couldn't even own property back in the day, right? Like that was an issue. And if we did, we could only own property in certain areas, but then we couldn't get loans in those areas because they redlined. And then the places we could get loans because they weren't redlines, we weren't allowed to purchase. See, it's like it was all this crazy cycle.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is all like realities.
You know your stuff. You talk about redlining here. I mean, that still exists in some.
Oh my God, yeah. They say it doesn't, but it does.
Right.
Yeah.
And even the generational, as you mentioned, it's like, you know, if redlining happened from the 60s to the 80s or the 90s or whatever, there's an inherent, like, it's cyclical, you know.
Yeah. I mean, just even some of the issues regarding white flight. If you look at kind of a really good example is the Dudley Street Initiative. They have a really good documentary and they talk about the Dudley Street and how that, you know, the way that it got abandoned took 10 years for them to kind of bring back. But they talk a lot about like the redlining and some of the issues that happened within that community. It wasn't until the community itself kind of went to take it back, you know, that you saw some level of progress, but it really unmasked a lot of this. And some of the white flight that started was like one domino effect after another. Right.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about, I think we touched on it a bit with the policing, the over policing, and especially with your mental health background. You know, we're in some interesting times with George Floyd, the death, and a lot of activists that are talking about defunding the police. in major cities, large campaigns for that. So I wanted to get your perspective on that. And then the second part of the question was, a lot of these cities and activists are saying that if we look at the budget from the police, and it's the highest budget in any given city or up there for a highest, in any given city, what we need to do is really reallocate those funds. And one of the big areas for many of these cities is actually mental health. So that's part of the question. Like what programs would you have if they get money gets reallocated from police to mental health?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question. I think, so whenever we say kind of defund, I think it puts people in a panic. And I think the reallocation is a much better phrasing.
Right.
But if you look so to me, so people like you and I, like the George Floyd, to many people, this is new and it's what they're seeing now. But you and I know, and I'm a lot older than you, said this isn't new. Right. Like none of this is new, in how many of us have lived with a number of different fears, not just police, but systems, like so many systems, like our educational systems have failed us. Our health system, like right now we see this woman in New York, who died, and Worcester had a very high rate of infant mortality among African children and Latino children. It's very, very scary. One of the highest in compared to a city in the East, all of the East Coast. When you look at the women that die in childbirth, very high numbers. So like a lot of this stuff is scary. Like this could be me. I mean, just recently I had to, and this happens, I had a young woman, and she's having a difficult pregnancy, and she called me and I said, you need to go to the hospital. She says, they're not going to admit me. They already told me. I told the mother, call the ambulance right now. They're going to admit you because you have not been able to eat. Like she has a condition. And I said, you're going to end up going into premature labor. And we had to insist. It was crazy what we had to do to get this girl to get this attention. And sure enough, she was hospitalized. So, I mean, it's not just police. We're living in scare because we're not just going to die in hands of police. We're going to die in people who took an oath to heal us, right? Like, think about trans women, like women that are trans, but even women of color that are trans. Like, it's crazy. So just so many things like that. People are dying in so many levels. The fact that we don't get diagnosed, like the fact that, look what's happening in Puerto Rico, because of all the bombing that was done in Vieques, the high number of cancer. I mean, cancer is wreaking havoc in the island of Puerto Rico. So it's just a number of different things that we see that are causing death in our community. Right. So for me, this isn't a new topic. And so if you look at my trajectory and my history in council, one of my very first things I did in my first term was looking at decriminalizing sexual exploitation. And so really looking at not decriminalizing the women, criminalizing sexual exploitation, but decriminalizing the women. That we saw that everybody was seeing this issue of prostitution and this sex worker and whatever. But really, do they really have a choice? And what we began to see is that I wanted to investigate, and we began to see is that here in Worcester, the women were dealing with one or two things or both: substance abuse disorder and trauma, sexual trauma, really significant mental health trauma. And so one of the things that I called was to take that issue out of public safety and put it into public health. And if you look way back, you'll see articles that issue was taken out. Then we got an outreach worker to deal with people who are homeless, to deal with women who are out on the streets, to be able to decriminalize what needed to be treated. Mm-hmm. Right? We've been criminalizing for too long what needed to be treated. So this is not a new topic for me, and have been working in collaboration. Also, the issues of inequity. We started working about issues of inequity. The more we can get people of color within our police department, the more, again, understanding within each other we have, right? Right now that we don't have any African-American women, that we lost the one we had retired.
That's weird.
Yeah, crazy, right? When you think about it. So the fact that it was only a few years ago that we had our first African-American captain. We didn't have anything above a lieutenant. Wow. And then in the Latino community, we didn't have anything above sergeant. So, I mean, this just happened, so a lot of that I've worked on, this issue of inequity. I've been really trying to work with the officer who's doing diversity and inclusion, a really great guy, African American brother, and we've been working on trying to create a cadet program. And the cadet program would allow, like the chief of police in Boston, he started in a cadet program. It would really look at targeting specific populations. Let's say we don't have any African American women. We would target how to recruit and get, African American women within the police force. So different things like that. I've talked about youth and police dialogues, which we've had in my district that weren't police led. It was youth led, and it was also a dialogue, and it was just really amazing. It was a curriculum that was purchased. I've talked about restorative justice for years. I actually helped bring a mindfulness program to Claremont Academy. I've talked against the resource officers for many. So again, if you look at my trajectory, this isn't of now. So what I'm going to do now is continue the work that I've done, and just continue to work on those things. So for myself, none of this is new. And I hope there was only so much. Remember when I started, I was the only person of color in our whole governmental delegation. Wow. And it wasn't until a few years that then, thank the Lord, we've had two other, we had Councilor King, and then we had Councilor Rose, and, it definitely was a challenge. And then being a woman is one thing, being a woman of color is another. At a time that, we were having a lot of difficulties within the city. We had the race dialogues at the time, which was disastrous. We've had a number of different things going on. We had a lot of youth violence happening, so the fact that we were arresting youth of color that were involved, there was a lot of things happening. And so this was an issue that we've been talking about. I think it gets enhanced now. What I'm hoping to do is when George Floyd is forgotten, because he will get forgotten, which is sad, right? As you know, not to you, not to me, not to many people, but to many others, it will, until the next George Floyd, the next Breonna, until the next George Floyd, until the next, Trayvon Martin. And then, I just came from Puerto Rico, everybody was talking about Hurricane Maria, but they're not recovered. I went to certain areas and I was practically in tears to see the lack of recovery. And now what COVID is doing, right, to the island. So very difficult, but then also seeing the resiliency. So what I'm hoping is that we have the $250,000 that people were asking for it would have been symbolic, but it wouldn't have really made a huge difference. And what we need to do is take a look at.
Sorry, when you say 250,000,
that's what people were asking for us to eliminate. It was an increase for $250,000 to the police budget, and they didn't want that increase. But what that increase was really about, police cars, and it was a structural. It wasn't anything. We weren't having the broader conversations that we needed to have, and I think it was because it was very reactionary. And I get it. I understand the pain, and I understand the importance of reallocation of funding, but there needs to be more than a knee-jerk reaction. There needs to be we need to have reaction, and we need to be able to have a foundation where we're actually seeing changes. There's an item tonight that I have on council that takes a look at how do we look at liability insurance. And with the liability insurance for police, it will help people it will help them become accountable. And there's a whole article that was done with this professor in Harvard. So I think it's really super important for us to take a look at what does this really mean, and what's going to really make substantive changes. Because in the long run, what I want is, when I'm out the door, when my husband's out the door as a Black Afro-Latino, Taino, as my sons who look as people of color, my son who looks Black, when they walk out the door, that they're safe. Not just from police, but from so many systems that have persistently failed them. When one of my sons was in elementary school, I had a teacher who wanted to convince me that he had some sort of dyslexia learning. And what my son had was a different learning style. And I taught him how to learn the way he could learn and what his strengths were. Fast forward years later, by the time he was 22, he had 3 degrees, one bachelor's and 2 masters, and his second master's was from Harvard. So
Wow, are you serious?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and my other same,
Wow.
yeah. I
That's
mean,
22.
if I would have listened to that woman, where would my son be right now? You know what I mean? The other thing, same thing. My other son, another son of mine, the same thing. And I caught it. They all thought I was crazy, but because I'm a clinician, I caught certain things. I took care of it. Taught him very early that this is how you learn. You learn differently than other people, but you learn. And guess what? He just graduated from his bachelor's in neuroscience. He actually published before the age of 20, before he graduated. He was first author on a paper, which is unheard of. He made a discovery in the neuroscience, which I can't even begin to explain to you what the heck it is, because it's so complex. It's beyond my understanding.
Yeah.
And he's now entering a PhD program, and he was coveted he got accepted to 4 or 5 Ivy Leagues, UPenn. He got Yale, UPenn, Princeton, UC Berkeley, which is an Ivy League, but Stanford, Princeton. And he was being flown out. He got like 8 different offers. It was crazy.
Wow, that is.
And he'll be going to Stanford. Columbia was another one, and they were coveting. They flew him out. They made him offers. He's,
Your boys, they're not going to be 4th generation preachers then.
I'm hoping that one of them. I have one. My oldest son is kind of doing his thing. He's in Iowa. He works in HR for a company. He graduated from Clark University. He's doing really well. He works in a company in HR, and he's doing really well. But since he's been in Iowa, he's been thrown kind of in the leadership role in his church. So I said, "Oh, and the generation continues."
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
He was a little resistant at first, but I think he has such a giving heart and a loving heart. He just can't turn away. So we'll see. But they're changing the world through education. My son is international studies, and he's doing education, and the other one, his goal is to win a Nobel Prize in science and make some sort of meaningful life discovery. So I think, and it's interesting because when I asked him, like, what was his reasoning for turning down like a couple of the Ivy Leagues, over, like, for example, Yale or Stanford, but that's the whole thing in their neuroscience. But one of the things that was interesting, he said regarding people of color that, a lot of times in those sciences and in those fields, like, there's not many people that look like him. Right. And that he wanted to see the commitment of the program regarding, people of color. And although many of them were very open to it, they didn't have anything set. It was almost like, oh, we're open to whatever you want to do. And he was like, they're kind of like at a space where they shouldn't have to kind of educate people. Like, people should just kind of be doing this, and I think he felt like there was much of a stronger diversity where he was going, and a more commitment to diversity, which was interesting because he's not very vocal. This particular son isn't very vocal, but you can see that a lot of the steps he's made and joining like kind of like STEM programs that were geared towards students of color was really significant.
That's pretty cool. Well, shout out to you for raising three boys, right?
Well, I raised 10 children altogether, 9 boys. Yeah.
That's nuts. All right, cool. Well,
that's why whenever people try to tell me about like whatever, I'm like, listen, no, please sit down. Please sit down. Don't tell me about anything. Like, I'm all open to learn, but you can't tell me how to be a person. Like, when you have, especially when you have somebody like non-person of color telling me how I should think about as a person of color.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel you. Just to kind of going back to the mental health field, question around that. Are there, especially as you practice mental health clinician, are there stigmas that still exist around the use of cannabis? Not necessarily like what goes on, in dispensaries, but actually like the use for patients.
Oh God, yeah, definitely. I think it's still kind of, this drug is interesting, that there's still, and also because it's not federal, right? We don't have it federal mandated. There's really this iffiness. So you have to watch it. You can't really talk about it. If you're in private practice or whatever, you can't, it's not something you can really recommend because of, the whole kind of federal government. So it's not like you can write in your treatment plans, you know, especially if somebody is like pending who's gonna audit or whatever. Oh, recommendation is to use cannabis. Like our psychiatrists are not really able to do that here. So yeah, that's, you know, and you see some folks that could probably benefit from it versus some of the other medications that could be habit forming. But also I think people are talking about kind of from a religious perspective. I think there's something to be said when the doctor gives you a prescription and you don't really question that because the doctor gave it to you, not knowing like like just recently my daughter-in-law had a C-section, and my granddaughter was born, and she had a C-section, and that was a whole other ordeal. But they gave her Tylenol, ibuprofen, Tylenol with codeine ibuprofen, and when I went to look, I said, "How are you feeling?" She was all pretty good. They gave her Oxycontin. And I said, "This is what they gave you?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "How are you feeling?" She goes, "Fine." And I explained to her what that medication was, and I showed her, and she says, "Oh my God." She goes, "I'm not taking that anymore." Right. She had no idea. No one explained. Now my daughter-in-law is a refugee from Asia, from Burma. Right. Doesn't, you know, English is not her first language. And so no one really explained this about Oxy. Right. That's really was scary for me. And so here she was trying to nurse, right? Trying to manage her pain. And thank God she had a whole bunch of support system, because she had me, she has her mom, she has a sister, and my son, who's been great with her during this time. But like no one explained. When I explained to her, she was like, "Oh my," I said, "Listen, when you gotta get rid of it, give it to me. I'll take it to the police station." She's like, "I'm not taking that medication anymore." Right. But no one explained that to her. And so I think that we just kind of take for gold what the doctor says. So in mental health, like, you know, people are already kind of resistant about medication. And then there's all this issue about the dual diagnosis because people are self-medicating. And I think that cannabis has been in that category of self-medication. So people are very leery about it, you know, because I think it's been misused. And again, on the street, you get what you get and you don't complain, right? You get what you get. It's not like the same in the dispensary that you can say, okay, I'm here because I sleep. I'm here because of anxiety. I'm here because of chronic fatigue, whatever. And you can kind of get, you know, there's all these issues on strands. Like we've come a long way on cannabis. Right. But that's not really talked. No one knows that. They just see it as you just buy weed on the street. Right, right. And right now, people with mental health significant mental health have been doing self-medication, and self-medication has been a lot of illegal drugs, alcohol and cannabis, you know, like it's been a lot of just a mixture, you know, you see a lot of dual diagnosis. So I think in mental health, there definitely is still that stigma because they see it as, you know, this kind of substance on the street. Right. Right. And you touched on it a little bit with the religious. I think, you know, growing up in the church, there's definitely a stigma that exists in the church when it comes to cannabis and alcohol. Mm-hmm. And on the flip side of that, you had touched on it a little bit with like not questioning people. Like, yeah. You know, sometimes I'll go home, you know, whether it be a family friend or whatever, and it's just like, you know, do you guys know what you're taking? Just because sometimes. Yeah, exactly. You know, but on the reverse of that, just kind of going back to like the cannabis, where people have that stigma and that idea that it's bad. Do you think that, you know, cannabis is a barrier to Christianity or being in the church because you use yeah, I mean, I think so. It's interesting how so again, I choose not to kind of drink or do anything like that, but that's my choice. But like in the Bible, it talks about it's about drunkenness, right? Like right. It doesn't say that if you take, there's a lot of people who have it and that's fine. And if you drink, you're not going to hell, right? If you smoke, you're not going to hell. You're just going to heaven a lot faster if you smoke, you know. You're just getting to heaven a lot quicker because you're going to die a lot faster if you smoke. In general, like nicotine. Like no one really talks about like these barriers of these things, but they see cannabis, and I think that is this illegal drug. But remember that a lot of these folks you're coming from a generation that fed that so much into us, right? This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. This is the war on drugs. Like we grew up in that generation, and many people prior to that was the 60s and the hippie revolution. So prior to me, the baby boomers were the, you know, the hippie, the wildness of like crazy, sinful Sodom and Gomorrah kind of world, right? Of like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Like it's the quaaludes and the pill popping and stuff all were attributed in the weed smoking. So again, it's always been associated to that. So yeah, you kind of really begin to see this barrier. I actually worked with someone similar to that, and just I think when this individual began to understand that, I think the person wants to just stop using cannabis, just because I think they utilized it as a crutch for many years. So that was different, but definitely not a barrier for this individual to kind of seek their level of spirituality. And if they were, it wouldn't be their causation of going to hell, right? Like, it's not like they're out there just striking a deal on the streets, or, you know what I mean? Or selling, or, you know. So again, if you don't condemn somebody that you see how many times you see ministers and priests and people like drinking a glass of wine and no one, or even bourbon, or I don't know what else other liquors out there, right? A little shot of vodka. No, it's like you see that celebrated, but the minute you see, like, you would never like visualize a cardinal lighting up a blunt. You see, you're laughing, but like, it's like in the eyes of God, it's funny, right? You think about that, but in the eyes of God, like, it is what it is.
Yeah.
So, you know,
even now, I mean, the fact that you bring up, you know, smoking a joint, I mean, that's one good thing about legalization, is that alternative consumption methods is like,
yeah, exactly.
You know, you don't need to smoke or roll up a joint. You can, you know, take a drink or, you know, take a capsule.
Yeah, all these edibles, teas, all sorts of stuff. I was just having this conversation with, I'm like, who knew?
Right.
Also, like, I don't know, I was just telling someone the other day, because you know, it was interesting because, like, everybody growing up, you kind of like knew what marijuana smelled like, right? Because you walked by different things in high school, like, unless you went to some anomaly of a high school, like, you know. So it was interesting because, like, now cannabis has like, I don't know, I find like I would smell like a skunk smell, and I would be like, there's a skunk around, and someone's like, that's not a skunk, that's weed. And I'm like, why is it different now? Like, did I miss something? So I guess somebody was telling me, they were a part of my education, that that it's like, you know, things have evolved, you know, in the cannabis world, and there is, you know, that people do talk, because again, generation now don't know about that stuff before. Like, yeah, they say, people who've been smoking for a long time say that there has been a change. There is a change in so much of it. And also, yeah, so that's interesting, one. And number two, yeah, that there's all this way that you can consume it, right? Like, who knew?
Right. No, that's great. So I want to go back to a home question a bit. I know you have ties to Connecticut. You went to UConn. What kind of recommendations would you have for someone that's in a position in another city like a Bridgeport?
Yeah, you know, education is powerful, and I think for me, and for many people like me in legislation that are doing legislation, education is key. Like, I've learned so much about so many different things. Cannabis is one of them. And I think, you know, like, I cared about the environment and stuff, but like, I never really paid attention about trees as much as I do now, you know, and I understood the importance of like trees and irrigation and air quality. And I've learned so much about environmental justice. So, I mean, I think with cannabis, I think that we need to just learn, like, really legit, like, learn about it, not what we've been taught, right? Because this goes along with the whole, let's dress up as Indians and pilgrims for Thanksgiving.
Right.
And let's, you know, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria for Columbus, like, all the madness. The fact that we grew up with Dukes and Hazzards and nobody thought it was a big deal that the car was a Confederate flag, like, stuff that we have been programmed to believe. And again, I think you don't have to be for it. No one's telling you to go consume it. No one's, you know, but I think the hypocrisy of, I say, if you drink, if you like your shot of wine, like glass of wine, your shot of whatever, and you go to, you know, the liquor stores, and you don't believe in having liquor stores closed, then you need to really have a really open conversation about cannabis and really learn about what this is about. And I think it's important, people like yourself, to keep educating people like me.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I got a couple speed questions here. And these are more or less like cultural questions.
Okay.
The first is, if there's a marijuana or a drug movie or a documentary that like you thought was really cool that you've watched before, what movie is that?
Oh, I don't think I have.
No, you've never seen a drug movie? You had to.
I'm sure I have. I can't trying to think. What the hell? I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I think, oh, I know. Oh my God. I saw Scarface for the first time when I was an adult. Like I was grown. Like I was probably actually within the last 10 years, I finally saw Scarface.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I had never seen Scarface. I also never seen Titanic, but you know, yeah. So I just stuff like that doesn't necessarily. I like action movies. Don't get me wrong, and I like but I don't know. I guess I never really appeal. So I finally wanted to kind of know what the hype was.
Yeah.
And I watched it, and I was just appalled by the whole damn thing. I just hated the way. I hated the way they, again, a society that, again, this is how they criminalize, they put everything together.
Right.
I think it had so many negative stereotypes. I hated how they glorified, but I also, I watched The Godfather, and again, how they glorify, negative behavior in the mob, and, oh, I know, actually, I watched La Reina del Sol, and I loved it.
Wait, what is it?
So the Queen of the South, but it was originally, so it's called, they have one in English. It was so popular in Spanish. So this really famous Mexican actress, her name is Kate Castillo. She did this, a telenovela, a series actually called Queen of the South, in Spanish, La Reina del Sur. And it was all about how she gets caught up in this drug kind of world. Mm-hmm. And she becomes a transporter. And it was kind of like what happened in the 80s and stuff like that. So, but it was so popular, they made a part 2 in Spanish, which they never do. They made a second. They're looking at a part 3, and they did an English series. They've actually done 2 seasons of an English series. That's how popular this series was. But yeah, that one, Queen of the South, was one I knew.
Was that real life, or was it based on a real person?
I think it wasn't based on a real person, but I think it had a lot of real stuff. It was Reina del Sur was one, and then there was another one she did that was based on kind of the 80s. I forgot the name of that one, and that one was really good too. It was based on kind of the accounts of what was really happening in the 80s and in Miami, in New York, and different places. But yeah.
Cool. All right. So what about music? What's your favorite music genre?
I'm kind of if you look at my iPod, if you look at my music selection, I'm really all over the place.
Yeah.
I'm a child that grew up in the 80s, so I love disco from the 70s.
That's awesome.
And I love Motown, and I love disco. I don't care how people think, but I also love rock.
Okay.
I was a drummer growing up, and so I love rock. So I could have anywhere from Kool and the Gang,
right,
to Rolling Stone on my iPad, on my iPod at the time, or really back then was those mixtapes. What? Don't play with the mixtapes.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm an 80s kid, so I love freestyle. Right? I love freestyle music.
Right.
And just now I love all different types of gospel. I love gospel and Christian contemporary. Mm-hmm. I love music. Obviously, I love cultural music. I love, believe it or not, I love Irish music.
Where did that come from?
I don't know. I went to go see Riverdance, and I'm like, Dad, this music is so good. And I'm I loved it. And I love the Celtic music. I love the instruments. I'm a big music lover. Uh-huh. And I love music that tells a story. I love bomba en plena. I love music that helps you feel your history. And I love the instruments in it, the vocals, the percussion and all of that. And I love obviously salsa, and I love
Do you still
merengue.
drum?
I mean, I bet you if I got on it, I can beat a little bit on there, but I haven't for a while.
That's cool. Do you have at your church? Do you have a band and choir?
Yeah. We have a little group.
Very nice.
That's how it kind of started, in the church playing my drums.
Oh, of course, I know. I was there too.
Right. Because, the PKs, we all did everything.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
So what about book? What book has helped you navigate your career? If there's one like standout recommendation.
There's a really good book that I loved that really helped me understand so much called Cheap Grace by Dr. Eldon Biafanye, which really understood like our mission and understanding who we are and our purpose, and like that we're more than just a church of four walls. But to me, my life is who I am. Everything of who I am is who I am as a child of God. Nothing else. That is number one. That is the same way I get up in the morning and I see myself as a woman, the same as I get up as a person. I am, to me, I am a divine creation from the divine creator. So that was really important to me. And there was a really awesome book by a gentleman called Dr. Smith called On the Jericho Road. And it's kind of a little bit of a memoir during the civil rights and kind of his journey as a Black man and also like as a Christian Black man. Like it just was powerful. And I was so excited when I finally got to meet him and got to hear him lecture, which was like, I was like in awe. So that book changed a lot of my life as well. It's called On the Jericho Road. He did, he was really amazing. He did like a speech for college. And when he was a commencement speaker, I mean, he did civil rights with like Martin Luther King. He was like an advisor to King. He was just amazing. But he did a speech called The Nigger Did It in reference to the Good Samaritan and how the Samaritan was like the word, nigger back in the day, that people kind of, the term Samaritan. Like if you notice when they talked about, when Jesus used the word, Jesus talked about the good, gave the parable of the Good Samaritan, that the religious leader didn't even say the word Samaritan.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, really interesting. And he talks about the Jericho Road, but he puts it in a perspective. He, in case you understand the Samaritan, but understands like the complexity of the Jericho Road, right? Your surroundings and what your place is. It was just amazing. So that was a good
I'll take you up
book
on
for me.
I'll have to check it out. So I got two more here. What age did you like interact with marijuana? I know you talked a little bit about 16 and the friend passing away. Did you recognize it earlier on?
Holy cow! When I went into middle school, it was like a drug free for all.
Yeah, and that's in Worcester, right? Bro.
Listen, I was it because here I am growing up a PK, very very fundamentalist. Like, right. Brother, I wore a skirt most of my life. Like, because I could tell you stories. So I get into middle school, which was called junior high at the time because it was 7, 8, and 9. I'm dating myself. And now now it's not just your community little school. Now it's like kids from all over. We were bused into the West Side, by the way. Right. Because we didn't have a middle school on our side of the city. We were bused to the West Side. So now we're integrating with kids. So you have kids from one side of Park Ave to the other side of Park Ave. Mm-hmm. And I saw cannabis and so much more. Like people were popping. Again, I'm in the 80s. Like they were popping acid, speed was very popular, in weed. And then as you got into 9th grade, I went to Doherty. So of course, everybody who went to Doherty knows the back of the school, the hill, where they used to have these crazy keg parties. So I remember one time we were having spree day, which they canceled after that year. And me and this other girl who also went to church, we're like, why are all these people going up the hill, right? So we decide to go up the hill, and we go up the hill and we see like kegs and everybody's getting hammered. And all I could visualize was that there's a raid. I get caught. And again, let me bring you back to my mother.
Wow. Yeah.
Bro, listen, I said, I looked, I freaked out. Me and my friend looked at each other. We ran down that hill, practically falling because it was so steep. Listen, no, I was like running like Sodom and Gomorrah. Like I needed to get out before the brimstone and fire came down on me.
That's
And
great.
so, yeah, it was crazy. I never seen anything like I grew up in a home where no one drank, no one
Yeah.
smoked, so all this was like so foreign. And like, I saw my friends like popping, or people that I knew and acquaintances, people in my class, they were popping like little acid. Why are you acting funny? He was like on acid. I remember this one girl, we were waiting for the bus, and she was like walking in the street. She had taken some sort of acid. I was like, why would you do any? I'm too much of a control freak. So I think I could never. So it's funny because I'm always in the non-drinking category. So everybody thinks I'm in rehabilitation. Like, you really know? Yeah. So yeah, that was middle school was my baptism.
No, that's amazing.
Which I freaked out. It was crazy the way I saw my friends or people that I knew acting. It scared the heck out of me. So I was definitely not doing it.
That's amazing. And you talked about your mom a little bit. I was curious to know, like, so including your mom and maybe your husband and even your son, how do your family perceive marijuana? Are there any marijuana users in your family?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think with my mom and dad growing up, again, it's a drug, and you're talking about people that probably the only drug they ever consumed was caffeine.
Right, right.
I think my father, when he was younger, once upon a time, not in my lifetime or anything I saw, but once upon a time in his younger years, I'm sure had a drink or smoked a cigarette. I don't know. But definitely, I mean, my parents have both passed on, but definitely would not have been pro marijuana. I think in my household, I think, again, I also have my children are very educated. I think I have a mix of people, but I think more my children that are very socially conscious, I think are, again, they grew up in a household of non-consumption of any type of substance like this, besides my husband drinking coffee, but kind of thing. But I think they're like myself. I think I have grown up in a different generation, and just see it as what it is, and I think have a different perspective of cannabis. It's not something to them they would probably use as recreation or anything they would, but I think if they, I don't think they look at people and condemn people for it.
Right.
I think the same way that they're not really big about drinking or anything like that. And I think that if they needed to, for medical purposes, I think they'd be open to, I think we're looking at a different generation.
Right, right.
That is not getting everything that we were fed.
Right. Which is super interesting because like in states where legalization has been around, teen use is down, you know what I mean? So like, when you legalize something, people lose to the feel a little, Maybe we want our middle schoolers, you're dropping acid if it was legal of some sort, mushroom.
Holy moly, yeah. I'd rather them just people smoking on the weed than some of that acid stuff they were doing, Oh, Lord, have mercy.
Oh, I feel you.
Yeah.
Well, that's all we got for today. I usually like to end with like, kind of talking a little bit about the students in this class. I alluded to it a bit, how, some municipal people, I actually taught a class in the summer where I had a police chief from a couple towns over from Worcester, some state employees as well. So like final thoughts on, especially from your perspective as a mental health person, also a pastor, but then also being a counselor, like just your final thoughts on like cannabis as a whole and where we are being as present as possible.
I think it's really important that we have a really good look at what pathology and what criminal behavior is, right? That's one. I think that we need to really have a good look at why we incarcerated so many people that were people of color, that now white, affluent, predominantly males are going to benefit from. So really looking at inequities, economic inequities and liberty, right? Like our sense of liberty. I think it's important for us to be educated. I think we need to take a look at how we've medicated, how in mental health and in general, how we've medicated and how we've not really questioned much. Well, in general, people don't have much of a question. And really looking at where our perspective of critical thinking is really important. I challenge people, I guess, to say that we use critical thinking, and critical thinking is not necessarily that we know what we think we know, but understand the concept of how we know what we know and where that is fed, how it's fed to us. And so I really feel like it's important for us to, when we approach the issue of cannabis, that we do it with a critical thinking lens. And if we can do that, then we can learn about it versus just have a no. And then you make your decision. But I think it's also like, for example, I choose to have a decision not to drink. That doesn't mean I'm doing legislation to shut down all liquor stores.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just, that's my personal choice. Right now, the law is law. Would I prefer having a world of no liquor? Yeah, but, you know, for many aspects. But, you know, you say that and everybody would have a heart attack. But, you know, they didn't even want to close during COVID. And people were like, you know. So I think it's really important for us to use a critical thinking lens when talking about cannabis.
Absolutely. Sarai, thank you so much for joining.
Yes, thank you for your patience. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem at all. No problem at all.
As a pastor, as a politician, a city councilor for District 4, I want to thank her for joining and sharing her perspective. I think, you know, as a person that wears multiple hats and even on the mental health scene here in Worcester and here in the state of Massachusetts, it's very valuable to have an influencer like herself be able to share her perspective. And I think that is very important when it comes to social equity in cannabis, is really just understanding who those influencers are and how they feel about and what they know and what they need to know and what they want to know about social equity in cannabis. So personally, you know, as a business owner in her district, I want to thank her. And then also just for, you know, ultimately being, you know, in a position to make change and really, you know, share her thoughts. So thank you so much, Sarai. And I hope you guys enjoyed the interview here and the ones to come in the future.